This is part 2 of our Marriage 101 series, episode 42, Finding Your Ezer Kenegdo, Leaving If Needed. Hello, welcome to Little Pieces Club at-home movies, or at-home videos. My name is Mr. Chris to the kids of LPC. I am a pediatrician for about 15 or more years. I've been working in an academic institution. I'm a child of divorce, and I created Little Pieces Club Ministries several years ago to bring biblical context and psychology to kids that have experienced family conflict, separation, and divorce. And what we do is we focus on finding a healing connection with God, self, and others as directed by the greatest commandments. That's our biblical philosophy. And for those of you who don't know, reading the Bible in context means stripping back the years and years of human interpretation and really looking at the ancient context of the Bible to understand what was going on in the minds of the biblical authors. And it really helps reveal some deep truths that I think have been lost for quite a while. Any of you who'd like to learn more about this, I recommend two ministries in particular. One is called The Bible Project, and the other is called Walking the Text with Brad Gray. You can connect with us on Facebook. The QR code on the screen will get you there. We do have Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok handles that we hope to use more and more as the ministry grows, and email is listed on the screen as well. Many of you may be unfamiliar with the format of Little Pieces Club, and where this got started was a small group activity for kids, and I've slowly expanded what we offer. And so what you're experiencing is a mini Sabbath where you get to take a break, cease from the work of life, and just hear positive messaging about some important topics. What we do is we have about 15 to 20 minutes of fun activity to get things started. And then make sure you have a very nice, good tasting snack as we go into the prayer time. And then we get going with the main video lesson. And then I say a prayer to close the video. And for those of you watching at home or in small group, make sure you set aside time to do some more fun and relaxing activities to complete the idea of Sabbath, which is rest, ceasing from work, and delighting in the world that God has made. So for our fun time, do anything that you'd like, but we highly recommend not using a cell phone or technology. So that means you can put this video on pause and have 15 to 20 minutes of just quiet time, journaling time, drawing time, fun time, playing cards, play games. Try not to play video games unless it's something that you guys find very fun. But remember to set a timer, and that'll bring you back to us at the right time. So I hope you had a good time with that introductory playtime and just fun time. So what you'll need today is a prayer template, but don't worry, it's on the next video screen. It's also available on our Facebook site and to download. And then oftentimes I give journal prompts, which we will in this video. And for the kids' activities, there's an activity sheet. And if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to submit them through the communication. Especially email is probably the best. And then if you use the social medias, tag them so we can build a community. But remember to be safe when you use them. So this is a time where you can pause the video if you need to. But this is what we do is each week we go through things that have particularly made us happy, made us sad, disgusted, angry, worried, and then things in particular that have been really, really fun. And while you're doing this, remember to grab that snack that I talked about. Remember, there's no dieting on the Sabbath. So review your feelings point by point, and then take them in front of God. There's some suggestions on the screen there, but feel free to pause as you go through that, and we'll see you when you get back. In every episode, I leave space for what I call Ask Me and Ask Each Other. And this is just our time to facilitate discussion about divorce in particular and how it impacts various stages of life. The asking me through social media is totally possible, and I would recommend submitting email questions. And if you're in a small group session with a skilled leader, you can certainly ask them as well. And then the next aspect of this is, if there aren't any questions, then the question for the whole group to discuss today is, describe your ideal spouse. And there'll be a twist to this idea, but let's build the idea of our ideal spouse. So this is probably the most important question you can ask yourself when it comes to thinking about a future marriage partner. So how strongly do you desire to find a life partner? So on one side of the spectrum, it's all I can think about. Or on the other side, God will bring us together on His timing. So the closer you are to 20, the more internal work you need to do. People that feel this way generally have had a childhood marked by conflict and low emotional health. And if this is the case for you, and if your parents separated, I would review the Grief series and both the private and public Christian journeys. Because ideally your relationship with God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit should be strong and will feed these starving parts of you until God reveals who your Ezer Kenegdo is going to be, who your future marriage partner is going to be. So if you enter into a relationship needing it to feel whole, the problem here is that it puts an unfair pressure on your spouse in the form of a particularly strong, invalid expectation of making up for something missing from your childhood. It also might lead you to have trouble ending the relationship prior to marriage for fear of causing pain in the other. Another issue found commonly in kids from divorced backgrounds. And we will revisit this idea in more detail a bit later. So remember, the closer you are to 20, the more you need to journal about the strong feeling that you have to be with someone else. And we also have videos that help walk you through the journaling process. And specifically spend some time on the 5 whys in terms of why would you have such a strong feeling? Why is it important for you to have a partner at any given moment? All those can help you get to the basics of what you need to understand about yourself before bringing another person into your life. Just as a reminder, we're going through the Marriage 101 series, and last time we talked about basic concepts that we're going to build on in future episodes. Today, it's going to be talking more in detail about the Ezer Kenegdo concept. And then we will add some time at the end to talk about ending relationships before they progress to the point of marriage, if needed, and some issues that can come up with that. But as we talked about in the last episode, remember, if you're called to singleness, that's okay. Some are called to not marry for a time or for life. And that's something between you and God and the Holy Spirit to explore. But remember, Paul gave us the spiritual suggestion that that's how he was. But then at the same time, he was leaving space for those who are called differently, because we are called to procreate and to make new humans. So it just depends on the balance of where God is transforming you and what you're going to be growing into. But don't forget that if you are called at any given time to singleness, that you're not undervalued at all. So we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about expectations, because these are the root of toxicity when it happens. So the elephant assessment test for this video already hit on the fact that deep in our childhood we can form expectations about marriage. And it cannot be overstated how important it is for you to enter into the search for your Ezer Kenegdo with a very, very healthy heart. Because when expectations are unfulfilled, that's when disappointment and bitterness set in, and these lead to toxicity later on. So as we talked about last time, common marriage journeys can lead down into what one author calls the crazy cycle and what I call marriage hell. And these are the toxic times in marriage. And these are can be avoided if you grow deep roots into the concepts that we're talking about with a hope-filled marriage journey, where it helps us live out the greatest blessings, find wisdom, and then operate with justice and right relationship concepts. Before we get too far into the Ezer Kenegdo concept, I wanted to just spend a time on talking about arranged marriages. And in our country in particular, there may be a growing awareness that this actually happens in other cultures. But in this day and age, many still are shocked to find out that modern cultures can begin marriages with an arranged fashion. Now, it's very quick. It's a very quick thing that we need to point out that this is not the barbaric or forced situation that we kind of maybe think about when we say arranged marriages. But what happens in the cultures that rely on this is that family and friends know individuals, and they are the ones that will suggest a match. And the couple will meet for dinner, maybe once or twice or even more, and decide if they are going to consent to be married. And then the true romantic courting happens after the marriage. And it's just, I bring this up because within the concept or within the context of talking about expectations, the expectations in these marriages are completely different than what we think about as the timing that happens that leads up to marriages in the West. And these are very successful marriages can come out of these types of situations. So it really is worth some time to think about as you're setting your own expectations for your relationship. So we're going to talk about the search for your Ezer Kenegdo. And the first most basic idea to think about is, are you ready? What state is your elephant in? Did you have a toxic childhood? Let's review the ideas of the public and Christian journey, the public and private Christian journeys, so that you understand the context of Little Pieces Club ministries, teachings, when it comes to getting ready for marriage. This is our summary diagram, and you can see that on the bottom half, that's what we call the private Christian journey. And there are several skills listed there that do not necessarily need to be acquired in any particular order, although for some order does seem to matter. They help you grow in your relationship with the Lord, and then prepare you and strengthen your public Christian journey, which is something that is shown to all that see you and watch you and listen to you know your journey. And these happen simultaneously. You can't wait for one to happen before the other. So you have to know that they're all happening at the same time. And at the center of the public Christian journey is the Ezer Kenegdo concept. And that is, we find people, best friends, marriage partners, that we can actually embrace conflict and disagreement in safety, finding love and wisdom and self-improvement in the process. And so that's the ideal that we look for when we are starting our marriage search. So the question is, are you ready for this? And at the center of all of these ideas and concepts is the idea of grieving and forgiving. So in our suffering, we have to realize that we are never alone, whether it's acknowledging God is with us, even though suffering happens, or that we are best with other people in community, whether it's 1 or 2 or 20. There are aspects of us that are not developed until we are with other people. So it is this idea that we start with the end in mind, so that we are assuming that we're in a healthy place to find a mate, knowing what you're looking for, other than a great-looking person with a good personality, is important. And just remember the fact that Ezers find love and wisdom in conflict. Greatest commandments require that we are just as understood as others are. So when two seek God's love and wisdom and the answer together, that's the ideal. And remember, grieving is at the center of all of this. The basic issue that we are grieving is that we are not the ones who determine right and wrong. God does that. And we must forgive God, forgive ourselves and others when they fall short. And when I say that, we're forgiving God for creating a world where we are not the center, because that seems to be the root of a lot of our frustration when it comes to God. And when we finally realize that God is sovereign and He is the focus, then our lives develop so much more peace. So how do we start our search? Where do we go? I feel silly sometimes talking to younger folks about where they can go to find people, because dating apps account for around 20% of relationships and even marriage. So that's 1 out of 5 serious relationships. Instagram, TikTok, and other ways to connect online are going to connect people. And so digital natives are going to be able to find people no matter what. But many people still prefer face-to-face meetings. And so around Christian circles, look for youth groups, like-minded Christian groups, service groups, anything like that. And I do really recommend to center it around Christian structures, because it's much less complicated later on in life if you start out a relationship with very similar religious convictions. Although, as we know, life is messy, and it seems that sometimes God just has a particular path for us. But remember, the first place to begin is, are you ready? I fell prey to the strong desire that I needed to be with someone in order to matter. God had my back and brought me to a wonderful person who I'm still married to, but I was probably not ready. And many people are not ready to settle down until their late 20s or perhaps even early 30s, depending upon the tasks that they have to overcome from their childhood. So don't forget the importance of the private and public Christian journeys. So if we had the opportunity to build your life, you would be a strong individual person with a good degree of security and the ability to make it on your own prior to finding a spouse. But if you find a spouse that you feel that you need to grow together with, that's okay too. You just need to talk about this as an expectation that you guys have things that you need to improve upon. And even a healthier place is to invite the other person into that growth process with you. And don't forget to pray. Pray persistently for God to bring you your Ezer if you're ready, and that's what you desire. So a little bit of a checklist to think about is to pray, as I just mentioned. Pray to God to reveal your spouse, or to give you the wisdom and peace to know that it will come in time. The next thing to do is always be honest. There's a great movie that came out in 2021 called Love Hard around the Christmas season, and it really explored this idea of honesty when you're meeting other people, and forming a foundation of true honesty is really what leads to good relationships later on. And a couple Captain Obvious statements are coming, but looks are important, but they are not everything. So remember that over time, you do learn to accept people a little bit more. So even if at first the looks don't do it for you, remember that as you spend time together, people become much more attractive as you learn and grow. Another Captain Obvious statement is this person a good balance of safety but passion? Do you feel healthy, happy, growing? Are you becoming a better you by being with this person? Or are you hiding more and more of yourself just to make them happy? You want enough shared interests so that you can do things together, but it's also very, very healthy to be interested in other things too. Next, Christian. Do they share your religious convictions and a sense of the future? So these two are very important things to think about at the initial outset of the relationship. Yes, it's possible for people to convert to Christianity after they've met, but it just becomes a very difficult path. So the next thing is, I asked in the lead-in to today's video, what would be your perfect spouse? What would they look like? And that's to set you up to this point to say, forget that picture. There's another great movie called About Hope that you can find on Prime Video. It came out in 2021, where it was a thought experiment where someone had in mind their absolute perfect mate, and they fell prey to problems that came out of this concept. And it was a nice movie to watch the people overcome this idea of perfection. Finally, we do have a whole video coming up about managing the sex fire. But while we delve much deeper into this later, culturally we see messaging all over the place on how important sex is. Sexual health is an afterthought in many discussions, and that is, sex is best contained within the boundaries of marriage because it is life-giving and life-taking, quite literally. And so it does become an important thing for us to treat it with reverence. And I know this is countercultural, and you'll watch TV where it's expected on the second or third date that people share sex. And I really, really ask you to kind of think about that and think about what that means. Because for especially men, sex means that love is happening. It's a love and bonding experience. And many often don't feel fully fulfilled after casual sex anyway. And for women, it's a very much lower priority when it comes to emotional bonding, and they need to understand what it means for men when they do it. And so you have to take a look at that within the context of the relationship that's forming. And I would also strongly say that if you're physically attracted to another individual, one of the best things about marriage is learning how to do sex together in a much healthier way. So it's a skill that you can build together once you're married, is one way to think about it. And so you don't have to have it as a checkbox moving into marriage. It can all get worked out later on. It just becomes the expectation that you guys need to work out together as you grow in your relationship. So sex also depends a lot on if you're ready. Ready for what? Not ready for the physical act, but ready for trusting and letting another person be responsible for your happiness for a brief moment when you're most vulnerable. This is what true interdependence is all about. Will sex in your relationship be about two me's getting what they want, or is it about one us that is fulfilled together? When it comes back to the question of readiness and what do you want, if you feel a deep need for sexual attention, check yourself. You are probably missing a big part of your identity that you think sex will bring, but that's a sure red flag that you need to do a lot more work. So now we're going to charge forward into the Ezer Kenegdo concept. We're going to take a deep dive into an ancient and a modern picture of an Ezer Kenegdo. Again, we are following the wisdom principle. Begin with the end in mind. Understand what a challenging helper is. So all the way back in Genesis, when God said it was not good for Adam to be alone, he made a challenging helper for him. And again, probably the best description of Ezer Kenegdos comes from Brad Gray, an author and contextual scholar, who states it this way. An Ezer Kenegdo is someone who questions, confronts, challenges, and holds another accountable in love for the purpose of aiding and strengthening the collective whole, so together they move forward in a healthy and growing relationship, doing for each other what they were unable to do alone. So we're going to first spend time in an Old Testament example here. I have a whole long video on the book of Esther, so we're going to spend some time just summarizing it. But I have a few thoughts before we do that. So a couple things to keep in mind when you get deep into the Bible. The Hebrew Bible especially, so that means the Old Testament, is intentional meditation literature. We will proceed as if the gender role in this story is intentional. Of course, there will be expectations when it comes to gender roles. One can be like the other and vice versa. But sexes are biologically distinct. One has an XX chromosome, the other has an XY. And there are complementary differences between the two. And when I say complementary, it fits the Ezer Kenegdo concept, which is two together are better than one by themselves. And they are co-equal heirs to the kingdom of heaven. So these two are not mortal enemies, as implied by some modern ideologies. They are bounded by the concept of right relationship, which respects the mutual divinity in both partners. So a question that's running in the background is, what are the biblical authors saying about relationships between men and women? And in the story of Esther we're about to see, there are some pretty interesting conclusions that we can draw. To get the most out of this video, I would first recommend listening to the book of Esther in audio format. If that's something that you really like, if you'd like to read it, that's also possible. YouVersion on smartphone and Bible Gateway is a great free place to get various versions of the Bible. The Bible Project has a great video on Esther as well. So as you listen, be thinking about what the author is saying in regard to how men and women relate and work together ideally. So when we're thinking about Esther specifically, remember that the storytelling is intentional. Details are left out or left in a meaningful way. And so the question becomes, why is that detail there and not another place? So proceed as if gender is important, because Esther is definitely in a queen role and Mordecai is a male advisor. God is never mentioned in the story of Esther, but his fingerprints are all over the story for Jewish readers. Remember that this was an exile period, and it may have been that this story had to come about without specifically mentioning their God. But it's an interesting question to ponder nonetheless. So we're going to look at the basic story, which is brought to you by the Bible Project. So here what we see is a very, very intentional shape to the storyline, where we get to a low point and then a high point. Almost verse by verse, we see what happens. So in the first movement, we see introductions of the main characters, including the king, who is kind of who represents foolishness and the non-Hebrew ideology and thinking. And then we see him go into sort of win-lose and lose-lose and lose-win thinking with his previous wife. And that'll become a little bit more important later as he meets Esther. So next we meet Haman, who is a hater of Jews, and this is Mordecai. And then he decides with his power that he's going to kill the Jews. So he rolls the dice to figure out which day it's going to be on. And then when Mordecai finds out about this, and Mordecai is essentially a father figure to Esther. So there we go, talking about gender roles in this circumstance. Esther had caught the king's eye and became his queen, and so she was suddenly elevated to a very high status within the Persian world. So Mordecai was alerting her to the fact that the Jews were in danger and was asking her to do something. And we'll get much closer, we'll take a closer look into that conversation in just a minute. But all the while, Haman is planning to execute the Jews, and particularly Mordecai. But then Esther makes a position, a statement of courage, and states that she's going to move forward with Mordecai. And then we see the story begin to pivot, where Haman is now subservient to Mordecai. And then the Jews and the Hebrews suddenly begin to have some hope that they're no longer going to be persecuted. Haman is impaled for his evilness, and then the king allows Esther and Mordecai to save the Jews. And Mordecai becomes elevated, much like a shadow of what happened to Joseph in the previous exile, or when he was taken to Egypt. And then finally we see this picture where Mordecai and Esther have saved the day, and this becomes remembered in the culture by the feast of Purim, which remembers the dice that was thrown to set the date. So this symmetry of the storytelling shows how well thought out it was, and gives us a lot to think about. And basically what I'm calling to our attention is the idea of the Ezer Kenegdo in the background is of prime importance for us. So if we take a quick closer look at the design pattern, we see in the Persian way of thinking this idea of foolishness. And we see foolishness contracted to wisdom in the book of Proverbs. And then what we see the Hebrews, who represent the wisdom of the story, a little bit later on. So we can see this contrast of foolishness and wisdom playing out. So when the king demands that Vashti be brought to him, and then she turns her back on him, he goes into this use of power in terms of win-lose and ejecting her and showing all of these non-win-win dynamics. And that is what is playing in the background of a lot of marriages and problems in relationships, is that this type of power domination structure leads to emotional starvation. And so it doesn't take much to realize that that's not going to keep a relationship strong and healthy for very long. So this is contrasted with the ideas in the greatest commandments, and that is that we are to love God, self, and others equally. And when we love God, we see that He is sovereign and that He exists at all. So when we see and believe in Him and then apply His love for us to both ourselves and other people, we're living out what are known as the greatest blessings. And then this concept is bounded through the use of wisdom, justice, hope in the unseen when we're going through suffering, and right relationship. And that means to not be using power dynamics to exert emotional control on other people. And there are areas in the Bible that you can read more deeply on these topics if you would like to. So then, what is the ideal relationship? So now we will focus in on Mordecai and Esther. So Mordecai reminds her that there is a problem and states that maybe this is why you've become queen. And she eventually relents to this logic. But let's take a look at the actual scriptures so that we can see how this transpired. So in Esther chapter 4, 7 through 17, we see the central part of the conversation. So Mordecai tells the servant of Esther what's going on, that the Jews are going to die, and that he asked her to do something about it. And then we'll pick up in verse 10, Esther's reply. So that all the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So the servant gave Esther's message to Mordecai. So then Mordecai, instead of just going along with what she said and her fear of putting herself at risk, reminds her of some other things. And this is done in the style of an Ezer Kenegdo. So don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace that you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but your relatives will die. So remember, he's saying God will save us, but maybe he's trying to use you as the best way to do that. So who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just a time like this. So after she ponders this part, she then agrees to this whole idea and says, "Go and gather all the Jews and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or 3 nights, and my maids will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die." So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So breaking this down thematically, Mordecai makes a request. Esther worries. She has some anxiety about this. And remember, in the Bible, what are we told about fear? So many times when we are confronted with a job for God, and that is, don't fear. So Mordecai then brings in the greatest commandments and her loyalty to community and God, and reminds her of this. And then Esther then asks wisely for community support, showing the courage that she needs to move forward. And then Mordecai does as she requests. So they end up working together to fix what's going on. So what we see is with Mordecai and Esther, the community, and God, it becomes a win for everyone. And that's how we know that true wisdom was at work here. So both Mordecai and Esther show wisdom together in this Ezer Kenegdo concept. And remember, this is not a portrait of a passive woman acting at the prompting of a man. She shows her mastery of the Persian culture, rules, and values to influence the king and the outcome, and that is with God's help. So again, we see the Ezer Kenegdo style relationship is not a power dynamic where one is forcing the other to do anything. It is a win-win-win mode of thinking. So we see this style, we see this happen throughout this relationship between Mordecai and Esther. So in marriage, one study noted successful marriages are marked by the quality of the relationship between the wife and her father. So this implies that fathers are supposed to father at some point their children with this Ezer Kenegdo concept in mind. And remember, it's in truth and love relating to one another so that both can grow. So as a daughter sees her father grow and transform, she too grows and transforms at his promptings. So Esther and Mordecai have this relationship. She is adopted because of a death in the family, and we see his deep concern for her. And this ideally is what women can be looking for in their men. So we see honest negotiation that brings about loyalty to God and results in more good for God's chosen people than could have been foreseen if either had acted on their own. So now I turn hopefully to more of a fun picture of a modern Ezer Kenegdo, and that is The Notebook. It's a older movie, but it's a very, very great illustration of Ezer Kenegdos in the beginning of their relationship. When we watched this earlier, or just fairly recently with my family, and I was meditating on this whole idea of the Ezer Kenegdo, I saw it pop out very, very strongly in this movie. So I do encourage you to watch it. So in particular, we get to a point in the movie where Allie and Noah have to decide what they're going to do moving forward. And Noah says some extraordinarily wise things that I think we need to review. Stop thinking about what everyone wants. Stop thinking about what I want, what your parents want. What do you want? Noah is honoring Allie's decisions and is encouraging her very strongly to come up with what her heart is telling her. So it's not going to be easy. It's going to be really hard. We're going to have to work at this every day. But I want to do that because I want you. I want all of you forever, every day, you and me, every day. So again, Noah is showing very good wisdom in realizing that relationships don't come easy. They take hard work. And are you finding a partner that can do that hard work with you? And what he's also doing is setting up a very realistic, valid expectation for the couple as they move forward. After Allie pushes back about how much they fight, he says, well, that's what we do. We fight. You tell me when I'm being a jerk, and I tell you when you're being a pain in the butt, which you are 99% of the time, and I'm not afraid to hurt your feelings. You have like a 2-second rebound rate, and then you're back doing the next pain in the butt thing. This is healthy conflict. In our day and age, we've become very, very focused on abusive conflict that's dehumanizing. It's very important that we remember that conflict can actually be empowering and cause two to grow as they are together. So self-study, you can pause this video and take a break because it's really, really long, and watch The Notebook and just think about these Ezer Kenegdo concepts as we move forward. So this discussion that we've been doing is all about sort of having an idea of the type of person you're looking for, and also knowing the biblical basis for which good marriage partners begin. And that's the Ezer Kenegdo concept. But a couple of things as we pivot from finding someone to what we do when we let go. Couple of thoughts that I needed to share. Number one is don't marry for potential. One big mistake people often make in choosing a marriage partner is overlooking a flaw and just simply expecting it to get better. The foolish thing to do is to keep silent and hope for the best. The wise thing to do is to do the work and make a valid expectation about it. Talk through it and see if it's realistic to see this changing. Because what will often happen is that an individual will take something that they think is part of their identity. But then if they get a sense that their marriage partner wants that to change, they can actually become quite rebellious about it and hold on to it, even though objectively it may not be the best thing. So the wise thing to do is to talk about it, is to say, hey, I'm not really geeked about this particular part of you. What do you think about that? And you don't have to put pressure on it as an ultimatum whether this changes or something. But if you are getting that sense, it's important to talk about that. And that'll lead us into the next discussion that we're about to have. So the whole point here is to make a valid expectation about certain things. Is it going to change? Is it not going to change? How does that influence your decision to be with this person long term? Whether it's the habit of smoking or not working out or something else. Is this a part of the person's identity that you're just going to have to put up with? Or Is it something that they acknowledge they can change and grow? The most ideal situation is two healthy people deciding that they are going to grow and change together with help from the other person. And that is probably one of the best valid expectations you can come up with in dealing with certain things that are flaws or not that great between people. We have to pause for a minute, and I have to talk about the sleeper effect. And what this is something that can impact us much later in life. Those of us that are from divorced homes and perhaps even toxic situations may deal with this as we're beginning to start lives of our own later on. The sleeper effect is all about fear. And of course, the Bible tells us so many times not to fear. And the answer is to actually think deeply about it and not let the anxiety or fear drive you, but to make it much more intentional. So the effects of divorce are twofold. There are the acute grief and stress-based reactions and the adjustments to new life that happen within 1 to 2 years after the divorce. But then as children age and become young adults, the sleeper effect becomes possible. And that is when they start dating and considering long-term partners, our brains and hearts start reliving the divorce and reprocessing it, I guess is maybe the best way to say it. And it can make people very uncomfortable when they come up with questions that they don't have the answers for, or if they feel like they don't have trust in their own ability, or they're fearful that things are going to happen outside of their control. And then another aspect of this is being afraid to hurt the other person and therefore staying in a relationship too long. But let's take the situation first where people are generally happy, but you suddenly start to look forward long term, and then anxiety can just overwhelm you. And this is what happened to me. When my wife and I realized that we were wanting to stay together, it suddenly brought all sorts of fears into my mind, and I didn't have insight as to where these were coming from. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Also, you can just be uncomfortable with intimacy. So all of the LPC videos were created to slowly help people gain the skills that they need and the wisdom that helps confront this idea of the sleeper effect. And you may indeed need to seek out a counselor. But if you find yourself overwhelmed by a sudden fear or sudden doubts, or when things were going really well, that may be the sleeper effect coming down on you, and it may be time to seek help. But the other way that this can happen, and it's just as damaging, and that is if you objectively have a sense that you are not a good match with another individual and you'd like to break things off, but you don't because you have such a fear of hurting the other person's feelings. So many report that they stay even though they know they shouldn't. And this is a terrible foundation to build a long-term relationship on. It's very lose-win, and it's not loving. It's not a loving self-sacrifice, but actually it's a foolish response to a situation that's very hard. So remember the sleeper effect, 2 basic ideas. One is a sudden, strong desire to leave a relationship that is otherwise going well. And the other is being afraid to leave a relationship for fear of hurting your partner like you hurt after the family was separated. But there's one more aspect of the sleeper effect that we need to talk about, and it's the exact reason I'm doing this series today. And that is the fact that for many, because they didn't see good and healthy marriage skills growing up, they are burdened every day of their relationship with not knowing what to do. For instance, one person reported that they'd had a fight with their spouse, and because of that fight, they thought that their marriage was going to end. It's as if that child of 5 or 6 saw their parents fight, and then the next day the divorce happened, and it was that fight that caused the divorce. So these types of perceptions can be carried with us into our adult lives and burden individuals with fears and childish thinking that are not helpful in the adult complicated world. And so in this case, the spouse came home and didn't think anything of it and was just ready to move on with the evening. And so the person realized that they had lost an entire day to this fear that the relationship was going to end. And again, this is why I have the Little Pieces Club curriculum put together, so that we can find the biblical wisdom that helps us get over these concepts that may trickle into our thinking as we emerge from a toxic childhood or one that we don't have a lot of resilience. So that is doing the hard work of the Christian journeys and becoming as emotionally healthy as possible and able to work cooperatively with your spouse is the other part of the battle. Once that we know and we're aware of the sleeper effect idea, we have some tools that help us. So remember that relationships thrive when both people are win-win thinkers, and this makes God very happy. So that means that we're looking for win-win-win thinking. But if one or both of you have the sense that things are not working, it's not the right timing, you're not connecting the way that you'd hoped, it is the most loving thing that you can do for them and yourself, and that is to end the relationship before marriage, kids, or other things happen. And you do share a bond, and it's not the deep, healthy bond that will provide the foundation you need to grow a marriage. So you'll need to grieve for the loss of that bond. And then how does that look? And then what if they break up with you? So all of this means that we need to take a quick look at the skill of grieving. So what happens if we need to end the relationship? So knowing what can happen with the grieving process is extremely important. So now that we've seen and spent a lot of time on things to look for in a possible spouse, that even the timing can be unpredictable, we're going to spend a little bit of time turning to the question of how to end things if they turn out not to be our ideal. And there is a 7-part series on grief if you want to dive deeper into it. So grieving, as many people know, and we typically apply this concept to end of life, but we grieve large and small things all the time. And so the stages that we need to remember are shock or denial, anger, sadness, bargaining or questioning, why did it happen to me? And then acceptance. But there's an additional step for Christians where we increase our resilience and closeness with God as we've gone through our grief. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But as you're going to hear me say a couple of times, the important part of grieving is to realize that it's a process that ends. So many times we don't even realize that we need to grieve, and we basically get caught emotionally in shock and denial. And that, again, is another very, very deep theme and concept with Little Pieces Club Ministries, that we need to give people permission to grieve well so that they can become stronger after that grief process finishes. So the important thing to remember also is that you don't move through shock, anger, sadness, bargaining, acceptance, and thriving in an orderly fashion. You can realize that it is messy, and you may feel anger one day, sadness another, feel totally fine, like you're in denial again, and realize that this process will go on, and it's important to let all your feelings flow and to honor them as your body and brain and heart is working through the grief. So you may be angry one day. You may then be sad. You may then start bargaining. Then you may go back to shock and denial. You may go back to bargaining. You may then go into sadness. You may then be angry again. But then something starts to happen, and that is those feelings begin to fade, and you feel them less and less strongly. And that's when acceptance begins to happen. And then there's an additional aspect of this that we need to talk about when it comes to Christian grieving. And the question we ask often is, where is God in all of this? And this could be existential suffering or your own suffering. So the suffering of other people and in this world, or where is God in all of this? And this has been written about for hundreds, if not thousands of years. This point that we can get to where we think God is gone, or God may not be there, or it's terrible that God allows all this suffering. This is called the dark night of the soul. So when we have big losses that come with lots of pain, we often wonder, where is God? And why did he do this to me or do this to us? Where is he when I need him? And like I said, we call this the dark night of the soul. It helps to know that you're not alone in wanting God to make all things better. Many people feel this for lots of different reasons and for many different types of pain. So no matter how you feel about God, tell him, yell at him, even curse at him. It's part of an open and honest dialogue that you want to have with him. If you want to see this in Job, go right ahead. This is why I like journaling. You can journal anything. You can say anything and just keep your journal locked up where people can't get at it. But you're in a stage of when you're in a stage of not being able to tell your parents, for instance, or tell other loved ones, you can always tell God, and it is an extremely powerful resiliency tool to do that. So for thousands of years, people have been lamenting that God's world is filled with suffering, and it's not the way that they want it to be. But after we spend a lot of time in this dark night of the soul, guess what happens? There's a new sunrise. There's a new awareness that dawns in our minds. And that is, all of this is us trying to set what's right and wrong, and God, and holding God to that standard. After we realize that we do not determine right and wrong, that's when our new life with God begins. And we realize the very hard lesson and why grief is at the center of the private and public Christian journey is grief of the fact that we are grieving our ability to determine right and wrong. And it's a very, very strong fight. But once we realize that God is sovereign, that means God determines what's right and wrong, and we stop holding on to that burden, amazing things happen. And we realize that we are moving into an Ezer Kenegdo relationship with God, where he is strengthening us so that we can transform and become even stronger and be an even better advocate for his kingdom and expanding it to other people. God is helping you become a masterpiece like we're about to look at. My dark night with God has helped me know how to help other people going through similar issues. It has brought me strength, and hopefully this strength helps you have hope. So this is what can happen when God takes the broken pieces of our broken hearts. He can make stained glass windows more beautiful than we can even imagine. And we have to trust him to do this work in us. He's making a masterpiece out of the broken pieces of our heart. So do not be afraid of grieving. It is a skill that you can get better at, and it's a process that, if done right, ends with you being a stronger and wiser advocate than you were before. It's part of life. The foolish path is to get stuck in denial. The wise and courageous path is to let the feelings come and work through them. So now we've talked about the big themes of grief and loss. So now let's talk about practical steps of letting go of someone who is not going to be your ultimate marriage partner. What's the wise and honorable way to do it? Well, in these situations, you should have a sense that you're not a good fit, but it may have taken a long time to figure that out. And maybe you're even living together, but you'll have a sense that you just want different things, that they feel more like a friend than an intimate partner, and that you don't feel safe physically or emotionally with them, and there's very little or no romantic spark. So in the deciding process, be very careful who you ask advice from. You want to control when the information gets out. You don't want them to hear it from someone else that you are thinking about breaking up. Once you do decide, wait 2 or 3 days. See if the decision feels right. It's always okay to change your mind. And then the next thing is, question if you're responding to the sleeper effect. Were things going really, really well, but then suddenly you had an overwhelming sense of fear? That could be a fear of intimacy, and that's something that you can work on together. Or maybe you need to take some time to get stronger yourself, and maybe that's the reason for the breakup. Do it face to face when you actually come to the idea of breaking up. With all the technology that we have in the world today, don't do this by text. Set up a meeting where you're in public, or maybe a park, or taking a walk, and just talk about it honestly. Set a very clear boundary that you don't have a romantic future. We want different things. Try to give them at least 1 to 2 concrete reasons so that they will know why. But the downside is they may try to bargain with these reasons. And then you may just have to come up with, we just aren't right for each other. And I think in the long run, it's best if we're not together, because I may feel like I want to be somebody different. I don't want you to be someone different. I don't want that for us. You might need to think more after the conversation. If they are being a true Ezer Kenegdo for you, they may challenge you, and you may find that that challenge is appropriate. So feel free to think about it if you need to. But always be honest about your reasonings and expect them to bargain, and also listen, but make sure you're being heard as well. Being sad after a breakup doesn't necessarily mean it was the wrong thing to do. You guys were close and shared a lot, and that takes time to get over. And it may be that the timing is wrong. Many relationships restart after a few years when you've become different people, and that's okay to let that process play out as well. So today we looked at expectations of finding the right spouse. Please take these concepts as blurry themes that will become much more clear to you in your specific walk with God as you find your challenging helper. When you find a person who loves you for you, but inspires you to do great things and gives you a sense that you guys can get better together, that's the basics of the Ezer Kenegdo. And this all happens within emotional safety, with giving some wisdom to mild discomfort if that results in growth. But what you don't want to see is dehumanizing challenging. So when honesty comes easy and you're not afraid to speak your mind and you find your heart singing, you will know. When you can clearly see flaws in them and yourself and form valid expectations about these moving forward with respect to growth and transformation, you have probably found the wisdom and the balance of passion that is a great foundation for life together. So for a brief exercise, you can either journal or discuss the 2 statements below. So first, I know he or she can be a better person. And 2, we love each other as we are and aren't perfect and will grow stronger together. So which of these can lead to a foolish situation and which can lead to a wise situation? Which expectation on its own is invalid and which one implies or shows a valid expectation? And then for your own self-study, which two topics reviewed in the video caught your attention and why were they important for you? And spend some time talking about the whys. So we'll begin to close today's long journey with Lectio Divina. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. So reflect on this and decide which aspect seems to make a lot of sense to you today. And we'll read it again. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. So think about how God is asking you to respond to this. Does he just want you to think about it, or does he want to make it an expectation in who you're looking for? As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. So once you've connected with the message that you are supposed to receive from this scripture today, rest in that knowledge. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. So we'll pray to finish out today's episode. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your sovereignty. We know you are holy and set apart in your power and influence. We know your thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and we are grateful for all of the blessings you have bestowed upon us, which include our hard times. May the spirit of forgiveness take over our hearts and make us strong and steadfast in your love. Please, Father, bless our future spouse and marriage journey. We look forward to finding our challenging helper, the one who we will join in a spirit of cooperative growth and love to form a family that honors you. If we came from a toxic childhood, help us know when we are ready to find our special person. Bless us with the spirit of wisdom, as you did David's son Solomon. Lord, we seek to live out the greatest blessings for you, ourselves, and others, all so we can be your hands and feet in expanding your kingdom. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I hope these rather long meditations, which I also hope you figured out you can listen on double speed and also pause at any time, have been helpful in considering marriages and relationships. And we'll have the next episode out very soon.